Hey everybody, today we're going to be looking at the spending multiplier, and we'll discuss what it is, how to measure it, and a little bit about what affects the relative size of the spending multiplier in the economy. So first we start by reminding ourselves of the formula for GDP, which we need to make sure we commit to memory. We said that GDP is consumption plus government plus investment spending plus net exports, or CGI. X minus M. Any change in any one of these components will have an effect on total GDP, and the total effect on GDP will be greater than the initial change, either in consumption spending, government spending, investment spending, or net exports. And so we need to sort of understand why. So let's start by looking at consumption. Consumers have disposable income. You have money that's available to you to spend or save. There's really only your two choices. You either get rid of it or you keep it. And your tendency to spend money is known as the marginal propensity to consume, or MPC. And the way we measure that is by taking the change in consumer spending over the change in disposable income. How much of every new dollar that I earn do I choose to spend? The alternative to spending is saving. We call that the marginal propensity to save, and that would be the change in saving divided by the change in disposable income. And because there's only two options, consumption or savings, spending or save, we can reason then that the marginal propensity to consume plus the marginal propensity to save is equal to 1. Or put a different way, for every dollar I earn, every new dollar I earn, a portion of it has gone to consumption, that's the marginal propensity to consume. A portion of it went to savings, the marginal propensity to save, and together those two add up to the dollar that I earned. We could look at it as a graph or a table. We could say that if I have a disposable income of $13,000 and it increases by $1,000 to $14,000, my total consumption would go from $13,000 to $13,800. So if I'm trying to calculate my marginal propensity to consume, I would say that consumption increased by $800 divided by an increase of $1,000 in my income. So 800 divided by 1,000 tells me that I spent 80% of every new dollar I earned when income went from $13,000 to $14,000. So my MPC would be 0.8. If I go from $14,000 to $15,000 in income, I see that my consumption rose from $13,800 to $14,500. I increased consumption by $700 when my income increased by $1,000. So that means my MPC would, in this case, would be 0.7. And if I went from $15,000 in income to $16,000, then consumption increased by $600 for every $1,000 I earned. So MPC is 0.6 and then 0.5. It also then stands to reason that marginal propensity to save would be 1 minus MPC. So when I went from $13,000 to $14,000 in income, savings went from 0 to 200. So that's $200 in savings for the $1,000 I earned. So 200 over 1,000 equals 0.2. Or we could have said 1 minus 0.8. We still would have gotten to 0.2. If we go from $14,000 to $15,000 in income, my MPS is going to be 0.3 because that's 1 minus MPC, and then 0.4 and 0.5. Sometimes MPC is assumed to be consistent or constant no matter how much I earn. Sometimes it changes like it is in the table. Either way, you should be able to calculate marginal propensity to consume or marginal propensity to save based on data like what you see in the table. So consumption grows anytime marginal propensity to consume is greater than 0. The formula we're going to use for the multiplier is 1 over 1 minus MPC. That's going to tell us how much every dollar spent in the economy, every new dollar spent in the economy is going to grow over time as a result of this reality that my spending becomes your income. So let's take a look at an example. Let's pretend that Andrew and Lily and Marcia and Pat and Sandriana all have an MPC of 0.8. So the MPC is the same for everybody. If Andrew spends $1,000 in consumption, new consumption, at Lily's shop, Lily is going to receive $1,000. Now, she's going to save 20% of that because that's her MPS. So $200 goes into savings, but then she has $800 that she can spend and will spend. So she spends $800 at Marcia's shop. Marcia then receives $800 because Lily's spending is Marcia's income. Marcia is going to save 20%, spend 80%, which means that now she's going to spend $640 with Pat, who now has $640 in new income. He'll spend 80% of that at Sundriana's shop. Now she has $512 in new income. She spends $409.60 worth of that with Alex, who receives $409.60, and it goes on and on and on. So at this point, without continuing to go through the process, we've seen that Andrew's initial spending of $1,000, increase in spending of $1,000, has led already to $2,361.60 in additional spending beyond what he did. And there would be even more if we were to continue going through this process. We can actually calculate the final amount using the multiplier formula. We could say, given the formula, 1 over 1 minus MPC is the multiplier, we'd say 1 over 1 minus 0.8, which gets us 1 over 0.2, or 1 over 1/5. So the multiplier here is 5. So Andrew's $1,000 in spending will lead to $5,000 in total spending as it trickles down through the economy. Now let's take a look at what is going to cause changes in consumption. So changes in consumption will occur when there's a change in future disposable income. Your spending increases when your expected income also increases. So if you're sitting there at work and your boss comes in and says, hey, you know what, next month I'm going to go ahead and give you a 10% pay raise, you're realistically going to start spending that pay raise now. You're not going to wait because you have full expectation that's going to happen. And so you begin to live into that income now. And so, and conversely, if your boss comes and says, hey, you know what, at the end of the month, I'm going to have to let you go. You're not going to continue to spend today like you did yesterday because now your expectations have changed. You now expect your income is going to drop to zero. So you're going to start behaving as if your income has already dropped to zero. So you'll begin to see changes in consumption based on expectations about what's happening in the future. We also see that happen when there's a change in wealth. When your wealth rises, consumption tends to also increase. And so we see this with things like the stock market. When people's investments rise in value, we tend to see then that people feel wealthier, and because you feel wealthier, you act wealthier, and you tend to spend more than you did before. So we see an increase, a marginal increase in overall consumption. Now, it also turns out that investment spending also has a multiplier, just like government spending also has a multiplier. And just like a change in our net exports will have a multiplier effect. And so you can see that there is sort of a connection between investment spending and GDP growth. If you look at the table and you look at some relatively recent in history, recessions, you'll see that investment spending is wildly negative during those recessions. And so these investment spending patterns are an important measure when looking at the economy because they do multiply throughout. That's why numbers like housing starts, for example, which falls under investment spending, right? Building of new houses, is an important measure for the overall health of the economy, because if investment spending in new construction shrinks, that has a multiplying effect throughout the economy. As fewer houses are built, there's less material being purchased, which means there's less income in the hands of people who run lumber mills, for example, which means they have less need for employees. And so then there's less spending on employment, which means people's incomes drop, and you see this sort of multiplying effect. So investment spending is a big deal. What impacts investment spending? Well, 3 things that we're interested in. One is the interest rate. Second thing is our expected real GDP in the future, and then also our current production capacity. These are all things that go into deciding whether or not to increase investment spending from the side of business. With interest rates, you got to sort of decide based on how much the cost of borrowing is. So the decision to spend is based on whether or not I think I will earn enough in additional sales to justify the borrowing cost to finance my investment. So you could look at a company trying to decide whether to build a factory or not. Should they build a new manufacturing plant or not? Well, if you expect the rate of return to be 5%, you expect to earn 5% more on your money, then you have to look at the cost of borrowing. If the interest rate is 7% for the loan, then the answer to the question, should I borrow, is no. I shouldn't borrow money. I would never pay $7 to get $5 back in return. That's silly. So when interest rates are greater than the expected rate of return, we don't borrow money and we see a drop in investment spending. But if, on the other hand, the interest rate is 3%, then yes, we'll go ahead and build that new factory, because I would be glad to spend $3 to get $5 back. I'll do that every single day, all day long. So this interest rate is a big issue, and it's become a bigger issue when we talk about monetary policy a little bit later in the course. Expected changes in GDP also affect our investment spending. If we expect an increase in real GDP, that means we're going to need to have an increase in output to go along with it. And so investment spending needs to match this expected need for output. The faster GDP is expected to increase, the more we'll see an increase in investment spending to meet that need. And that sort of goes hand in hand with the idea of production capacity, which is how much you can actually make in a manufacturing setting. If you have excess capacity, it means that your output is less than the maximum you can produce. And so when there's excess capacity, we tend to see a decrease in investment spending. The closer we get to the ceiling, the maximum that we can produce, the more likely investment spending is going to become. So for example, let's say we have a manufacturing plant that can produce 100,000 units of whatever it is we're making, but there's only 50,000 units that are demanded. Well, if that's the case, we have a 50,000 unit excess capacity. So will we need to increase spending and investment to meet the needs of the market? And the answer in this case is no. So there's no need for additional investment spending here. But if demand were to increase to 125,000 units, that would eclipse the ability for us to produce, right? It goes beyond our capacity. So in this case, we would see an increase in investment spending in order to meet the need of the market. And with this investment spending increase, we would still see the same multiplier of 1 over 1 minus MPC. Like I said, there is also a multiplier for government spending. We'll deal with that when we talk about fiscal policy in another couple of units. Until then, we'll get to practice in class, and I'll see you then.